The health of the Chesapeake Bay has been a topic of debate for several years now, but one thing that cannot be debated is the importance of the aquaculture, whether it's how they keep the bay's balance and harmony or providing people who live on Delmarva with employment. Oyster harvesting can be a way of life for many on the shore. So here to tell us more about how we can better preserve this important resource is Kate Livie, who's a local author of Chesapeake Oysters, the Bay's Foundation and Future. Thank you so much for coming in.
My pleasure.
So let me ask you this right off the bat. What in the world made you interested in writing about oysters?
Well, I think most people sort of look at an oyster on a plate and they might be a little turned off by its appearance, but I've been eating them since before I really knew what they were. I'm a local, grew up in Chestertown, Maryland, and my grandfather would get a bushel in the cold months of the year, what we in the oyster world call the R months, and he would shuck them at the picnic table right into my mouth. So, you know, they were really the food of my childhood. And I think I always just thought about them as a delicious, you know, Chesapeake treat in the winter. But it wasn't until I started working at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum that I saw how connected they were with our past and with our present. So, you know, going all the way back to the Native American period, Native Americans were harvesting oysters. They were, in the wintertime, their camps would move so that they would have access to this oyster harvest. And, you know, then moving through the colonial period and the 19th century and the packing houses and the oystering industry and the oyster wars. And then today, we've got our own modern version of an oyster war. As aquaculture grows in the Chesapeake, it's going to impact our traditional culture. And I think a lot of people are really wrestling with, you know, our waterman values and our traditional values of oyster harvesting, and then looking at a much more sort of scientific method of oyster harvesting, but it's definitely a break from that long tradition. So it's all tied up in who we are as Chesapeake people, our sense of place, and of course our culture and our foodways.
Right. Speaking of that, you talk about one in particular, the eastern oyster. Tell me about that.
Crassostrea virginica is the species that we find in the Chesapeake Bay. It's what we think of as the Chesapeake oyster, but it's the same species that you find all the way up to Nova Scotia and all the way down around to the Gulf. So Blue Points, Apalachicolas, Chesapeake Bay oysters, they're all the same species.
Right.
But depending on where they are, they have sort of different flavor characteristics, and that's why people name them differently. That's how you get the different varieties.
Okay, so there's something called boutique oyster farming in the Bay. What is that?
And this may be something that you know, viewers who grew up in Delmarva may not be familiar with. And I know that I certainly wasn't, as you know, when I was a kid. And it's really a brand new form of oyster cultivation in the Chesapeake. Instead of a waterman who might go out and harvest oysters from the wild, what we're seeing in reaction to oyster disease is the growth of this whole new side of oyster harvesting, where people will farm the oysters in floats and cages or on the bottom. And these oysters are really sort of carefully tended, just like a crop. So they're often brought out of the water, they're turned, they're shaken, and they're put in tumblers so that they get a cup. And it's sort of like a semi-precious stone, you know. That's you know, everything's done just to you know, specification so that you get this beautiful product. And unlike the history of the Chesapeake, where most of the wild harvest was sent to packing houses and they were shucked into those big brightly colored oyster cans that so many people collect. These oysters are going to the white tablecloth market, the half shell market. And so if you go into sort of a ritzy oyster bar today, what you're likely to see is these oysters that have been farmed and carefully cultivated. And you might spend, and this may shock some people, up to $4 an oyster so that you get something that is consistent, that is excellent, that is something that you can compare to oysters from the region. And so it's a really developing aspect of the oyster industry. And it's a great area of growth for anybody who likes to eat oysters, because it means we have more options than we ever have before.
Okay, so for somebody that doesn't know, explain just exactly what the oyster does for the bay.
So for generations, for at least 150 years, we've always thought about oysters as benefiting the economy. We've been very focused on maintaining oyster populations so that people could go out and harvest them. But it wasn't until the 1980s, after Hurricane Agnes and some series of major sort of environmental problems in the bay, that people started to look at oysters a little differently. And there were some studies done at Horn Point Labs where they were able to determine that oysters actually performed these incredible environmental benefits to the watershed. So oysters are what we call a keystone species. They are absolutely essential to the habitat and the life within the Chesapeake. And anybody who's ever participated in one of those oyster nurseries or adopt an oyster cage programs knows that when you pull it up off your dock, all these little animals fall out, like little mud crabs and naked gobies and fish and all sorts of things are swarming around. And that's because these oysters create this sort of underwater reef structure. It's like Finding Nemo, but everything's brown. And the idea is that these oyster reefs take a two-dimensional bottom and they make them three-dimensional. So, for example, do you like to eat rockfish?
All the time.
I know, me too. Well, the reason they're called rockfish, other places call them striped bass,
right,
but in the Chesapeake we call them rockfish because watermen always called oysters oyster rock. And they would see the apex predator, this striped bass or rockfish, swimming around the oyster rock, and
right,
that's how they got their nickname.
There you
and
go.
To me, it's a clear reminder that they're this keystone architect of the Chesapeake Bay's bottom, but they also filter the water.
Right.
So that's the other thing. If you have a 50-gallon tank of muddy water and you drop one oyster in there, within 24 hours, it's Windexed. It's perfectly clear.
Let me ask you this question. You talk about the bay's future. What do you think the future holds?
I think it's a tremendously exciting time to live in the Chesapeake and enjoy oysters. I think we're going to see our wild oyster traditions continue, and I know that they are really essential to, our Chesapeake way of life, part of what makes this place special. I also see the growth of oyster farms, and along with that, this incredible transition in our oyster consumerism. Instead of an all-you-can-eat oyster bar, we're going to have a new generation of people that are interested in their food sustainability.
Right.
They're interested in sort of the flavor aspect of their oysters. And they're going to be looking maybe for an oyster that you might enjoy like you would a glass of wine, and that you can compare between different regions.
Right.
A northern oyster versus a one that's saltier from lower on the bay, for example. So, I mean, as an oyster lover,
right,
I think, man, we've got years of good eating ahead of us.
Right. Kate Livie, author, make sure I get it right, of Chesapeake Oysters, the Bay's Foundation and Future. Thank you.
That's right. Thank you
for your time with us. Now, if you'd like more information on Kate's book, all you have to do is go to our website, WBOC.com, and click on our picture there at the top of the page. From reading to watching television, you welcome Scott Pelley into your home every night on the CBS Evening News. Up next, we're going to learn more about the man behind the desk. WBOC Steve Hammond drops in to tell us more about his one-on-one interview with the network anchor. You're going to hear what Scott says are the challenges facing network news.
But first, you have a chance to win a brand new roof for your home. Spicer Brothers Construction is looking for the neediest roof on Delmarva. The winner will get a new GAF limited lifetime roofing system.
For your link to an entry form and a complete list of rules, just go to WBOC.com and click on our picture there at the top of the page, and good luck to you. Delmarva Life will be right back.